Welcome to the launch of Bryony Rheam's collection of short stories, Whatever Happened to Rick Astley. The collection is published by Parthian Books of Wales and Amma Books of Zimbabwe, and I'm Jane Morris of Amma Books. The collection is 16 short stories that give an insight into the lives of Zimbabweans over the last 20 years. Bryony is an established writer, and her two novels have won awards, the novels being This September Sun and All Come to Dust. The launch is going to take the form of a conversation between Bryony and Professor Thabisani Ndlovu in the Department of Literature and Cultural Studies in Walter Sisulu University in South Africa. Tabs' particular interest is in the intersections between race, gender, and ethnicity in Southern Africa. We hope you enjoy the launch. We'd like to thank the British Council for helping us in the making of this video. And now I'd like to pass you over to Bryony and Tabs.
Hello everyone, my name is Thabisani Ndlovu, Associate Professor of Literary and Cultural Studies at Walter Sisulu University in South Africa. Today I'm going to be discussing Bryony Rheam's latest offering. It's a collection of short stories called Whatever Happened to Rick Astley. But maybe before that I should mention that Bryony has got two novels. The first one is This September Sun, and then the second one, All Comes to Dust. So let me read what I see in front of the cover, Bryony, because it does capture what I thought of this collection myself. So Karen Jennings writes about the book: skilled, perfectly formed, and compelling. A deeply satisfying collection. I couldn't agree anymore with this evaluation of this book. It's a very curious title, I must say. But to get things going, tell us about the writing of Whatever Happened to Rick Astley. The creative process that went into it, the inspiration, and everything else really that a writer goes through before they give us something like this.
Okay, so the collection is a collection of 16 short stories that have been written over the last 20 years. The oldest story in the collection is The Queue, which I wrote at the end of 2022. And it's the first story that I actually ever had published. And I don't know if you remember those days where the fuel queues had just begun. And what is actually quite interesting, I think, about the creative process is that what had inspired the story was something that had happened quite a few years before then. Actually, I would say probably in the mid-90s, where I happened to be in the post office, and there was this elderly lady. We were all queuing, and a man came to the front of the queue and tried to push in, and this elderly lady started shouting at him to go to the back of the queue. And it stayed in my mind that, this incident. But although I wanted to write about it, it was as if the opportunity to write hadn't arisen. And then when all the fuel queues started in the early 2000s, I just kept remembering the scene. And I suppose it was the whole idea of the queue. And one day I just sat down and I just wrote the whole story. I had to put that whole story together. So, so that's a bit of information about one of the stories. Some of them have been published before, The Piano Tuner, and also Christmas has also been published before, as have some other of the stories as well. I think that when we decided to put the stories together, not all the stories that I've written were included. Sometimes stories don't fit a certain theme, or they don't seem to go together with the rest of the collection. But I think, really, coming back to the title of the collection, Whatever Happened to Rick Astley, that's my latest story. And I think it seems to symbolize or encapsulate something about my own life. Coming to a certain age, hitting 50, I suppose. Identify very much with the main character in the story. And in fact, the story was inspired by a Facebook post that I made one Friday night when I was trying to stay up until 10 o'clock because I had to fetch my daughter from somewhere.
Right.
And I was thinking back to all those days in my youth when we always had to go out on a Friday night. We had to be out somewhere or other, and how my mother was always waiting for us when we got home.
Right.
And then realizing that you've taken somebody's place, that I'd actually taken my mother's place, And although I didn't want to be out partying, I was quite happy being at home, I think there's a sense of what now, when your children have left home, when you've got to a certain age, what now is there for you? So that's it's interesting, really, I suppose, where I began writing and where my writing is now.
Right. So I think we can safely say, some of these are old stories, so they reflect the spirit and moment of perhaps that time, and we have new ones that not only reflect what's happening now, but also look back and try to make sense of the present. Am I right?
Yes, that's very true.
Brilliant. And what, I know it might be too early to answer that question, but what do you think you have achieved through putting together this compilation?
I think what I've achieved is, I don't know, perhaps it's a way of looking at how I've progressed as a writer. Mm-hmm. The subjects that I've chosen to look at, to examine. I've never wanted to be a political writer, and I know that I've faced criticism over that before, where people, I remember when the September Sun was published, a reviewer on Amazon wrote, I was hoping to find out more about Robert Mugabe from reading this, and I didn't find out anything, and I thought, well, read a book on Robert Mugabe, So I've never wanted to be a political writer. However, I think we cannot escape the fact that politics informs our lives. The political situation is always there in the background. But you know what? People are people. We still live our lives. We still have hopes and dreams. We apply for jobs. We fall in love. We get married. We have children. All that sort of thing. And I don't ever want to crush a story with politics.
Right.
So I think where I see that development is perhaps moving away now from writing stories which are, perhaps specifically maybe not political, but they capture something about our lives here. But I'd really like to be moving to writing stories which are also universal, that have a universal appeal.
Right.
And I think that's also a mark of a good story as well.
Okay. And now, talking about that kind of appeal, a universal appeal, where you are not writing a story that's really political, so to say. I found one of the themes that's consistent throughout this collection is the passing of time.
Okay.
In fact, you have some middle-aged characters who are trying to make sense of their lives, but I think how they try to make sense of their lives is framed by a particular context. and I'll perhaps hazard to say it is the Zimbabwean context that frames that kind of thinking that they have. And you have a very beautiful passage here, and maybe let me just read it, not only because it talks to this idea, but it's one of the most well-written and beautiful pieces in the book. The main character here is thinking about what has happened to time. So it goes like this. How is it, she thought, that time can pass so endlessly slowly from the window of a classroom? How can it lie looped and coiled in great piles of delicious life, with all its promise of choice and possibility, and yet, without you noticing, unwind so fast? She saw it suddenly, how change was always there, surreptitiously working its way through life. The haircuts, the length of skirts, the archness of a smile. It caught you unawares. Yet it was the future that she feared. All those blank pages. It's a beautifully written passage. Now, what does this mean for your characters, processing the passage of time? And maybe if you could tell us what it means to you personally.
Okay, well, I think that, one thing that I'm always aware of is that time is passing. It passes by very quickly. We always think we've got lots of time to do something. And then when we look back on our lives, we realize how much time has actually passed. And I think that can make us feel quite insecure. You realize how much you haven't done, what you would like to have achieved, but you haven't. And I think that's what some of the characters also feel. I also think that perhaps there's a sense of not realizing that change has actually occurred. That you tend to think life is always going to be the same, but it isn't. And there's different periods in your life. And yes, you need to welcome in those periods, those periods of change. But I think, in Zimbabwe, I don't think we like change. I think it's one of our problems. I think we continually talk about how we want things to change. But actually what we want is to go back in time a lot of the time. We have this thing about this golden past and the time when everything was wonderful. It's one thing that I notice from when I teach young people who don't have this bank of memory of how things used to be here. Right. They get quite irritated if you talk about the past. And their response is always, but that's not how things are now. And it reminds me that I think sometimes we do cling to that a bit. And we need to move on. Change is not always a bad thing, but it can be a scary thing. And maybe that's something that we're afraid of. We're afraid of what are we going to bring in? What changes are going to be made?
Yes. But maybe the problem is that most of the change in this book, in your book, in the short stories, is associated with forms of decline, one way or the other. One is older and they don't have as much strength as they used to have. Maybe less zest for life. The houses have lost their splendor. They're deteriorating. It's difficult to maintain them. There are all of these issues. So the decline of infrastructure, indeed the decline of people. So I want you to comment a little bit more about this theme of decline. It really, really struck me. And for the most part, it made me sad. I'm not so sure that's how I should be reading it, but it did make me sad.
Yeah.
Maybe if you could just, talk a little bit about it and maybe go into one story or two.
Okay. I think the thing with decline is that from a writer's point of view, it's actually a great source of inspiration. When everything's nice and ordered and nice and tidy and clean and whatever, I don't think it can really inspire you to write, as deeply and really hit a nerve in the way that the subject of deterioration, does. I think that, unfortunately, there I was talking about change, and yes, there is change in our lives, but the change, as you say, tends to be a negative change. So, for example, all over the world, you've had shops which were the favorite, the favorite of a country, and those shops have closed recently because maybe, for example, like departmental stores are not the thing anymore. People don't want them anymore. But for us in Zimbabwe, I think the difference is that whereas a store might change its name, it might change what it sells in a Western country, here the store tends to go downhill, and so it's divided into millions of shops, and it looks run down and chopped up, and it just doesn't have that same feel about it. So change, unfortunately, does tend to be a negative thing here. I know a number of houses in particular,
Right.
which were really run down. The kind of place that you could drive past and think, oh, that place, they should just knock it down. I don't even know where you would start.
I saw a lot of that in the short story Castles in the Air.
Okay, yes, that's right. In Castles in the Air, where you would have a house that, maybe 50 years ago, the people who had it would have had an entertainment area or, a lovely garden, green grass. It would have been well maintained. But unfortunately, because of the economic situation, people can't maintain things as they used to. It's very, very difficult. Also, I think a lot of our houses were built in a time where, people had lots of help in the house, and I think that's changing now. You don't necessarily have a gardener anymore. It becomes quite expensive. So I think we're moving away from these big plots and big houses, and those that are still there, tend to be deteriorated. But I've also seen some places which have been amazingly brought to life. And so yes, something can be really, really sort of almost beyond rescue, but it can be rescued, and I think there's actually there's a message of hope in that.
Brilliant. Then one of the things that struck me in this collection is the level of interiority, by which I mean your characters delve very deep to understand their situation. One of the stories that struck me is the Colonel comes by, where it's a question of forgiveness, but it takes the main character a long time to realize that this is what is needed. And I can identify 3-4 more like that, where there's this need to dig deep in order to move on. These heavy subjects that the characters are dealing with. To what extent would you say these perhaps, have to do with how you've been making sense of your own life at this particular moment?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of me in those stories. I think that, the Zimbabwean situation, our particular situation, but I think also our, my own personal situation has lent me to be much more introspective than I used to be, and to spend much more time thinking about things, and realizing sometimes things aren't they're not very clear cut. Sometimes you don't know what you're going to do about something. You don't know what the answer is, but it's more about the process of trying to figure it out in your mind.
It's quite interesting that so many solutions are tried in that story. What were you thinking though in making the character go through all these hoops in order to find the one real solution to this problem?
Well, I think in that story, the actual solution was there at the beginning. Was there at the beginning of the story. The colonel had, who has actually has passed away. His spirit is somehow visible to his granddaughter,
right.
And she tries to tell the mother that and that he wants to talk to her, but she doesn't listen. And yet she then starts on a very sort of complicated way of trying to solve the problems in her life, and getting involved in some sort of rather, perhaps not the word is perhaps not shady, but not from her perspective, but some of the people who she actually entertains are a little bit shady, and who are obviously looking to make money out of the situation. And if she had only listened to her daughter at the beginning, perhaps all that could have been avoided.
Yes.
So I think this is perhaps how we are as people as well, that the solution is there often. And sometimes that solution is offered by somebody who we don't expect it from. Maybe she didn't listen to her daughter because her daughter is a little girl. And the thing is to take advice from people who apparently know more than you do.
Yes.
But actually you already have that answer.
Right. And that reminds me of the familial relationships that I see in this book, because a lot of the stories really revolve around that, and at the center of which is usually a mother. So the relationship between a mother and a daughter, or a mother and her son, tends to come to the fore. Maybe you want to unpack that for us a little bit. I mean, why are you focalizing these relationships? Why are you putting them in the fore?
You know what? I think that's where all our interaction really is. It's at that kind of level. And I think this is where it comes back to what I was saying about not wanting to write a political story,
Right.
but really stories about relationships between people, and all the, I suppose, the tensions that we sometimes have in certain relationships. I was thinking of the story moving on, where there's a man and his daughter who
Yes.
he doesn't really know how to connect with. And yet, by the end of their holiday, they have made some sort of connection together. I think these are the most important relationships, in our lives, and it's quite interesting to also examine them, in that kind of detail.
So this is you now wanting to focus on our common humanity, as it were. But still, I think it's inevitable that we talk about the Zimbabwean situation. If I'm not mistaken, most of the stories here are set in Zimbabwe. Now, what has been the effect of that setting on your writing? How does it inspire you to write? Does it in any way make it difficult to write, or does it make it easy to write?
I think, like I was saying about writing about deterioration, the Zimbabwean situation can actually be quite inspiring, because you see so many things, that perhaps you don't see in other countries where, which are far more economically or financially stable. Maybe those same things are not as apparent. I think in Zimbabwe, we've really suffered over the last 20 years, and it's actually very difficult to explain the way in which we have suffered. We haven't got bombs dropping on us, it's not a war zone or anything, but psychologically this situation has worn away at us, quite extensively. And I think it can really erode you. It can erode joy, it can erode happiness. You see young people who've got so much to offer, who really want to go forward in life, do things, and there's no opportunity for them.
Yeah.
It's always taken away from them. And it's not surprising then that so many people become quite depressed. They lose that hope in life. And I think all the characters in the book are battling in some way. That there's something that they battle, and perhaps always in the background somewhere is that political, the way that we're shaped, by the political situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, the political does shape, our everyday lives, like you are saying. And talking of which, one of the most powerful stories in this collection is Potholes.
Okay.
Where Gibson's Vanda, the main character, starts filling potholes that the local municipality should be filling in. And I think I'll leave it to you to explain a little bit about what fascinated you, and perhaps I'm sure some of our viewers will not even understand why is a man just filling potholes something that should be done by the city council, for example.
Yeah.
Maybe you could
Okay, so this story is actually inspired by a man who's always on a certain stretch of road, and he's always very chirpy. He waves to me. Sometimes I stop and I give him money for filling in the potholes. And it's a funny thing, the story of the potholes, because our roads haven't been fixed in years, certainly not the suburban roads. And it's something that every single Zimbabwean complains about. And yet I have seen people be so rude to these people who mend the roads. There are people who will go out and they'll fill them with sand and small stones and things. And then, obviously they're not doing it for nothing. They would like to be given some money. And I've seen people be really rude to them. And I've even seen people complain, what do they think they're doing fixing the roads or whatever. And it's a funny, I find that it illustrates a funny kind of mentality about us, that, we complain that it's not fixed. Yet when it's fixed by somebody who's not the city council, we get angry with that person. Right. Perhaps because, they want to be paid. Yes, of course, along will come a shower of rain, and the sand is all spread out of the hole. It's lifted out. The patching doesn't last long. But I always think these people are doing us a great service in helping to fix those roads. But it made me think, about somebody who sort of inspired by this man, it's about somebody who actually really enjoyed it, and that he treats fixing the roads as a kind of work of art.
Yes.
That he really gets into it. He really cares about the roads that he fixes, and then how things change, how people then ask him, they say, oh, could you fix this road, could you fix that road?
Right.
And then how it causes problems with other people who are also fixing the roads.
Like you say, it's quite strange. So it becomes a form of earning income, as it were. So these are self-employed people now who have taken the job of the city councils, and perhaps one could argue the government as a whole.
Yeah.
Right. So, talking of ironies, I mean, there's a story, The Piano Tuner,
Oh yes.
about, I think it's Leonard Mwale who is the main character there. So he inherits a business that used to belong to a white character, Jennings, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
And then he goes to fix a piano, or to tune a piano, not to fix. In one of the households, it's set in Dola, if I remember well.
Yes,
It's
that's
set
right.
in Zambia. And he finds an Indian owner of that house. And all manner of ironic things happen. For example, I'll just say what I observed. I think and I'll come to my question, because you seem to do this very well in your stories. In fact, you work at the level of suggestion.
Oh, okay.
We tend to fill in the rest,
Right.
and which for me is the hallmark really of a very good short story writer. You just simply sketch it. So it would appear to me that the owner of the piano is in a house that used to belong to a British person, and he looks down upon the piano tuner and assumes the position of the previous owner. And I thought, what a deep way of dealing with race. But before I give further evaluation of that story, can you just explain to us what was the inspiration there? What was the thinking?
Okay, so that story was also inspired in some way by a true story. When I was living in Zambia, there was a piano tuner who used to come to tune our piano, and he had, he still used the card of this man who had taught him how to tune pianos. And he was a white man who had left Zambia a long time ago. And it made me wonder why he still continued to use this man's card and not have his own name, put on the card. And so, it sort of inspired a bit of a story there. I think, that although that story was set in Zambia, I think we still have assumptions about race, here in Southern Africa, and that's what I wanted to show, in that story, that the Indian man was expecting a white man
Yes.
to join him at lunch, and how when he discovered that the man was black, he was almost insulted
Yes.
by it, but the good thing is that the piano tuner does come out of it as the stronger character, and he sort of doesn't give in to the racism that he experiences.
And talking of race, how much of that is really an issue for you when you write? I remember a couple of stories where the owner of the house is certainly white, well, judging by the name and everything else, and there are some servants who are black. Is this meant to reflect what is a situation or was a situation, are you going beyond the relationships? Because in one of the stories, the madame, because she's called that by one of the workers, knows so much about her helper.
Okay.
You know, where she's going to catch the bus, where she is going home, the situation there. So I was just wondering, is there anything that perhaps you were wanting to put across?
Well, I think that, as I said, I think our lives do tend to be maybe molded a bit, by race. And I think we have a lot of assumptions about race still in Zimbabwe. But where I think we are changing is that we have relationships between people. And so in that story, for example, it's no longer a case of you're the white employer and you know nothing about the people that work for you.
Mm-hmm.
I think that our relationships have changed. I think that we are seeing deeper connections between people, and that we're no longer thinking, well, that person's black, that person's white, that person's Indian, or whatever the case may be. I think we are, and I think it's a really good thing that we're now looking beyond those very rigid boundaries that I think were there before.
Mm-hmm.
And you have different friendships, you have different relationships.
Right.
And I think that again is a bit of perhaps a unique situation. I mean, where in the world really now do you have people who work for other people in the house? That's died off in so many different countries, and yet we still have it here.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are other places that have it, but it's no longer just that very straightforward employer-employee relationship. I think we are developing friendships and bonds and that.
Right. Mm-hmm. And I think we're coming to the end of our conversation. Now, if you were to look at your two novels versus this short story collection, I know it's a difficult comparison I'm asking you to make.
Yeah.
Would you say, this is a marker of maybe improvement is not the word, that's not the word I'm looking for. In other words, have you gone farther than where you were when you wrote those two novels with the addition of the new short stories in this collection?
I think there is something to be said there. I think the novels, because novels have a particular story and particular characters, I think they're very different to the short stories. Short stories, I'm told, are not as popular as novels, but I actually think that you can really see a writer's strength in a short story, perhaps more than a novel actually. I'd really like for people to see that development, that development from the first story 20 years ago,
right,
to the kind of stories that I'm writing now. Obviously, they're still all my stories, but I think there has been a change and has been a development, and I still think there's room for the short story in our lives.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I mean, after all, Zimbabwe is very well known for the short story.
Yeah.
Bryony, I did not congratulate you at the beginning. I should have started there.
Okay.
So let me say, better late than never. Congratulations on this wonderful, wonderful collection, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and which I would urge anyone to really get if they want to understand how difficult, for example, life in Zimbabwe is in general, but how even more difficult it is for people to go inside themselves to try and make sense of this difficult situation that find themselves in. So with that having been said, we've come to the end of our conversation, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Yes, I did, absolutely. Thanks, Tim.
Thank you very much.